I don't know about you, but I'm called and commissioned by God for community and communion. And so we continue. Called last week talking about ecclesia, that the church is not about buildings, it's not about organizations, it's about people. You and I who have been called from one way of life to a new life. In baptism this morning we turn from not only the being called, but being commissioned. In other words, sent, given us responsibility, a task that only you can fulfill. Indeed, it is God who takes our name upon God's very being when we go through the waters of baptism. Baptism is the beginning of our everlasting and eternal relationship with God. This is an unbreakable bond and promise that God makes to each of us on the day that we were baptized. That indeed there is nothing in life or death that can ever separate us from God's love. And I believe that God not only says to Jesus, "You are my beloved child," I believe at our baptism, God said the same thing about each and every one of us. "Oh, that's one of my beloved children." And also in the same way in which out of the waters of baptism Jesus was commissioned to begin his public ministry, we too are being commissioned into the ministry to fulfill. One, to fulfill our destiny, our purpose, our particular part, to play in God's continuing drama of justice and love and grace until it completely embraces all of creation again. Yes, baptism works in two ways, not one. Two ways. First of all, it is God's declaration, "You are mine forever." That's our hope, our promise. But it also, equally, it is God who is saying, "I have something for you to do. And I will use the story of the church to help you move in this transition, this transformation from your life before into this life of faithfulness before God. The life work that needs to be fulfilled in you." As Presbyterians, we affirm that baptism and salvation are not unto simply a free ticket to heaven. They're all about service. It's about what are we going to do after those waters that makes a difference in this world where Jesus walked and where we walk within the same grace and mercy. What do I do in response to thanksgiving to God for taking and embracing my life? What is my gift back to God for this gift? How do I participate in God's unfolding works of healing and mending creation to make heaven and earth one reality? Yes, indeed, in baptism we are being called to a new way of life. Paul talked about it as being our resurrected life. We left the old country behind, he says, and we're starting into a whole new world of being together with and for each other here in this gathering, but then to go in and change the world by the way that we're able to live out God's imperatives of a new ethic, a new morality. And so we hear this opening of Paul's letter in the 12th chapter of Romans. Present your bodies as a living sacrifice. In other words, not some token, something you give away, but your entire being is to be that living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God. And so we can't be conformed to the strategies of the culture around us. That's not where we get our direction, our purpose, and our values. But we are to be transformed by the renewing of our minds through the tender mercies and the restorative justice of our God. It may seem like a little bit trite after all the years that it's been used, but I still think it's the most simple way to understand that is for us in all of life to ask, what would Jesus do? What would Jesus do in that situation? And I think one of the passive answers for us to take away from that is that God would not want us to do any harm to ourselves to any other human being or anything within life in creation, God's good creation. But our response in faith is not simply passive, not doing something. It's also about doing something, an active role that we must take. And so this morning we're going to commission leaders for the congregation that will lead us in new forms of ministry. And we have to see each one of our lives as well as anointed, commissioned, appointed to take an active daily role in being the risen Christ at work in the world. That was Martin Luther, from our brothers and sisters in the Lutheran tradition. Any former Lutherans or present Lutherans in the crowd? There we go. I got it. He took commissioning, and how he understood the way that the church moved forward was what he called the priesthood of all believers. And that was a very radical thing to say in the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. And what he was saying was that all the authority or power or ministry happens through the priests or the bishops. Now it's everybody's responsibility. And so now all are part of both the priesthood of believers. Remember last week when we had that examination test? Those who weren't here last week, you missed the test. I'm sorry. But we measured ourselves in terms of a faithfulness to what it is to be called to a new way of life and the responsibilities that go along with that. And we realized that Christianity is something that is 24/7, 365 a year kind of event. And so the role of the gathered worshiping community today for its teaching role into each of our lives, that is to equip each of you, all of us together, for our personal as well as our collective ministry. We should be able to leave this worship service this morning and say, oh yes, now I know what it is that I need to do today, tomorrow, in the weeks ahead. To heal and mend relationships, heal the world, heal creation, some way. But also you should be going with the tools of courage and conviction and compassion to be able to do that. And if that doesn't happen in this room, then I have failed in what it means to truly honor and worship God. For we are the body, the living body of Jesus Christ alive in the world. Well, in the second generation of the Protestant Reformation, John Calvin, the quote, father of Presbyterianism, took the next step and said we won't even have priests or bishops in our sense of order and leadership and service in the church. We're going to establish no more hierarchies, but call people to servant leadership, not elevation of status, but a depth of deeper service as servants of God. And he established 3 ordained offices of the church. And it's where we get our crazy name Presbyterian that very few people know how to spell. But it comes from the Greek word presbyteros, or prosbyteron, which is the word for elder. Now every church denomination takes some scriptures and says, oh, this is how we're going to model the way that we organize ourselves. Because the church does need to organize itself. It needs order, or we know the church would turn into chaos. It's not about us all doing our own thing. It's all about us doing our thing together as one body. So he said there need to be elders in the church, presbyters. But also there needs to be the office of deacon. Another Greek word, diakonos, from the scriptures, which means service. So take out the one bulletin insert that you have this morning that talks about the 3 ordained offices of the Presbyterian Church USA. And so yes, the deacons are listed first, and their particular function and role and call within our body here is called the ministry of compassion and service. And so they help us to help each other, not only within this community as the congregation, but into the community around us as well. We're going to talk about that more next week, because that's our 3rd C, community. And we've listed the name of the new board members that will be there, calling us to those ministries. Then there's presbyters. One kind of presbyter is the ruling elder, and they have the ministry of discernment and governance. In other words, they're supposed to discern the way forward for us. What is God leading us to become in the new day that God has for us? How will we be and do church in 2014, 15, 16, and beyond? Looking down the road. But also there is governance to be done. People have to make decisions, and so we do that in a consensus-forming group of the elders that serve on the session. Their names are also listed there who will begin service today. And then the other kind of presbyter is the teaching elder. That is the minister of word and sacrament, and that's my function within the church. I have a teaching role to help us and equip you with the best knowledge, the best hope, the best direction that you need for your life to carry out your particular unique ministry. So this morning, if you're visiting with us, you're getting to see what it means to be Presbyterian in the way that we call upon people within the church, and we understand that to be the voice of God when you nominate and elect these people. And then the session sits down with them and we converse and want to get on the same page of leadership in the church, what it means to be a servant for this congregation. And then they come before us this morning to be ordained and installed to their office, calling us forward to ways of compassion, greater imagination, ways to be faithful, way to be more mature, more just, and more compassionate. This is what it's all about. These are the waters of baptism that call these people. And I can tell you to one, none of them ever felt qualified to do that work. But as they say now, God doesn't call the qualified, God qualifies the call. We baptize you in the fire of leadership. And God seems to work in this process, I think, real good. And so that's what we're about, living out of our baptism. But again, it's not simply the ordained offices that we share in the church. It's also about those who are not in ordained leadership as deacons or elders. Every one of you has a particular calling, a gift the Spirit has instilled in you, and how you are to be transformed in your mind into a new way of being in the world. Paul does list other gifts of the Spirit, different ministries of the church, and he has us list in the 12th chapter that John read for us this morning. And I want to review with you and listen, have you listen and say, gosh, is that what I'm calling to be and do? Is that what my part is? And so he lists here. This is not a full list, a partial list of what might be out there for us. And so first he says we have gifts that are different according to the grace given to us. But the first one he says that the church, to function, needs prophets. In other words, what is the best way that God's love and compassion gets worked out? Prophets tell us that that's wrong and this is right, particularly when it comes to the way that we either are loving or not loving God, or loving or not loving our neighbor. Prophets challenge us about the old assumptions of faith. We are not the church of the first century. We're not the church of the 20th century. We are the church now of the 21st century. God is still speaking, and the prophets need to tell us. What does the holy fire of integrity look like today? Any prophets among us? I sure hope so. But also there are ministers. Paul uses the word minister because, again, it's not me as minister. You are ministers. I have my function and part to play, but I don't do it all. You have your part to do. And I think ministers are those who can bring loving kindness to relationships, particularly with the most difficult people, because we know in the church there's some very difficult people. Not in this congregation, but in other churches. They tell us about them. I think these are people who have a passion for pastoral care. In other words, the pastor doesn't give all the care. We know this. You guys are great at caring for each other. That's a real gift. It needs to be blossomed in all of us. I think ministers are those who know how better to listen than to speak all the time. It's people with empathetic skills. God calls people to ministry. We need teachers, those who will help us to grow in our knowledge of faith, those who will see and draw the best out of the other person, who will challenge us to take the next great leap in faith. Or as Apostle Paul said, the one who will help us give up childish ways and childish ideas. Next, we need exhorters in the church. We don't use that word too much. I think if Paul was writing today, he said, you need cheerleaders in the church. In other words, you need people who will drown out the doomsdayers and the naysayers and return us to that place of joy, hope, and promise, even when we disagree with each other. Hopefully always doing so without destroying the integrity of the person or the relationship or the community. We need givers, Paul says. Those who work intentionally to increase their generosity. What was the text in the words in the Bible study this morning? Christians never to live by the minimum. Is that what it was? Never live to the minimum. In other words, the least that I can do. What's the most I can do? I don't know of one case where somebody has gotten into poverty by being more generous. And if you happen to do so, that's why the church is here to help you out to do that. We need leaders who are careful as well as attentive, to learn from the past but never try to stay there. Those who will ask what is the best new direction that we need to take in expanding our vision higher and wider, enlarging our hearts and our minds so that indeed we can know the mind of Christ in our life together. But he also calls for the gifts to be shown through you of the compassion. Those who attend to the most vulnerable and the most marginalized in the church and in society. Those who know how to extend hospitality to the strangers. Those who will remind us never to return evil for evil. And help us to creatively engage evil with God's goodness. So what is your baptismal mission today? Is it to be a prophet? To be a minister? To be a teacher, to be an exhorter, to be a giver, to be a leader, to be compassionate. On this day, we are not only to remember and cherish the promise of our baptism, but to live in, through, and out of those waters into this very moment of God's presence. God not only calling us and taking our names, but saying, go and do and be